Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us for another study of great chapters of the Bible. In previous studies, we've looked at entire chapters, we've looked at portions of chapters, such as parts of John chapter 1 and John chapter 3 in earlier studies. This time, we're going to look at two complete chapters of the Bible, Matthew chapters 24 and 25, but we're going to take it in two parts. Today we're going to go through most of Matthew chapter 24. If you're going to study this, I would highly suggest that you also include in your study Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21, as well as parts of Luke 17 and Luke 19, because they deal with the same kind of things that Jesus is talking about here in this, what's called the Olivet Discourse. It's called the Olivet Discourse because it takes place on the Mount of Olives, and it's believed that it occurs probably on the Tuesday evening of his final week in Jerusalem, just before his crucifixion. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus says a lot of, we know it as a chapter of woes. He says these things to those who are his enemies. And what he says there actually serves as a preparation for the prediction that Jesus is going to make here in Matthew chapter 24. Back in Matthew 23, he had stood before those who were his enemies. And throughout the book of Matthew, Matthew stresses the kingdom authority of Christ. Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the Christ. Therefore, Jesus is the King. He's the one with all authority. And Jesus mentions that at the very end of the Gospel of Matthew. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, Jesus said. Well, Matthew stresses that throughout. And in chapter 23, Jesus stood before those who refused to accept that authority. They refused to accept his divine commission, that he was the one who came in the name of God. They just rejected him completely. And Jesus told them at the end of Matthew 23 that they would be called to account for that. They would be forced to confess at some point Jesus' authority over them. In fact, if you've got that part of your Bible open, look with me at the end of Matthew 23. And at the end of Matthew 23 and verse 32, Jesus told the religious leaders who stood against them, "Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." Now, what Jesus said is sort of a prelude into what he's going to predict will come in Matthew chapter 24. And we should realize right at the outset of the study that this section of Scripture presents a challenge because of its use of highly figurative language. We call it apocalyptic language. And because of that, there's a diversity of interpretations. And because of that, it has been a playground for those who believe in premillennialism, that Jesus is at some point going to come back and institute a 1,000-year reign on the earth. But what some premillennialists fail to see is that Jesus here apparently is talking of two events. There is the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, in fact, the destruction of Jerusalem itself, as well as his second coming and final judgment at some point. Now, where exactly the change takes place, where Jesus goes from talking about the destruction of Jerusalem to his second coming, is highly debated. Some people see the change coming in Matthew chapter 24 in verse 29. Others see it in verse 36. Others see it in Matthew chapter 25 in verse 31, while others see Jesus alternating throughout. talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and his final coming. Well, that just makes it kind of confusing. We're going to try and figure out where that change takes place. Unfortunately, some have taken the extreme view that all the judgment language refers exclusively to Jesus' second coming, and that he accomplished that during the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, when both the city and the temple were destroyed. So they view both Matthew 24 and all of chapter 25 as dealing only within the time frame of the destruction of Jerusalem, which they equate as being synonymous with Jesus' second and final coming. We're going to consider for our study the two most common views, and we're going to designate as view one the change that some say come at chapter 24 and verse 36, where Jesus goes from talking about the destruction of Jerusalem to his final coming in judgment at his second coming. We're going to designate as view two that the change comes in Matthew chapter 25 and in verse 31. So let's get into our study. Let's see what Jesus has to say and the chilling prediction that he makes. In Matthew 24 and in verse 1, it says that Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." We'll stop there for now. Jesus' disciples point out the beauty of the temple, and it was a beautiful temple. It was 80 years in the making. It was gorgeous. The whole temple complex was a magnificent structure, and while the temple itself was completed in a relatively short time, construction on all the additional structures all around it continued till about 64 AD. And in just a few short years later, they were completely demolished by the Romans. Now, some of the stones in the temple structure itself, and in also building the surrounding walls, were as long as 70 feet long, 12 feet high, and 18 feet wide. And some of these stones are still visible in the remaining southwestern wall, what's called the Wailing Wall. You're familiar with the Wailing Wall. Some of those lower course stones, according to Josephus, were 30 feet long, 6.5 feet high, 4 feet wide, and according to Josephus again, the top 40 feet of the platform was covered with beautiful vaulted corridors with Corinthian columns, some of them 27 feet high, and so thick, Josephus said, that 3 men encircling them with their arms around them could barely get their arms around those beautiful columns. The temple, the wall, the surrounding structures, they were all built of white limestone, and they were reported to have been visible for miles as that white limestone reflected the glint of that Judean sun. According to Josephus, this building project was carried out by some 10,000 workmen. It was a magnificent structure, and no wonder for the Jews, it would have seemed that the destruction of this would have been the end of the world. The disciples in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 3, they want to know more about what Jesus said. And so they ask him questions in verse 3. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, it said, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Well, Jesus, or at least the disciples, seem to pose several different questions. And view one, the view that we spoke of before, says that in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 3, there are 2, possibly 3 questions that the disciples ask. One is, when will these things happen? That no stone left upon another. 2, what will be the sign of your coming? And possibly 3, and of the end of the age. Some equate the end of the age with the second question, what will be the sign of your coming. View 2 asserts that the entirety of the questions are concerned only with the destruction of the temple, since the wording of the same question in Mark 13, remember I told you to put that side by side, Mark 13 and Luke chapter 21 seems to only be concerned with these things, what's called these things in the questions there. Now, those who hold to this view say that, well, the disciples couldn't be asking about Jesus' second coming because that was not a concept that they were really acquainted with yet. They never expected Jesus to go away in the first place. In fact, at this point, they're still wondering if Jesus is going to be the one who is going to assert physical authority and reestablish the physical kingdom in Jerusalem. And though he had specifically taught them on their way to Jerusalem that he would be killed, he would rise again on the third day, they apparently still held to this physical view of the kingdom. And even up to, and maybe even for a little while after his resurrection, it still seems like they were kind of unclear on this whole second coming thing. So there are those who, according to view 2, say that that's not what they're concerned about. But think about this. For the Jew, the destruction of the temple, of the city, would have been associated as the end of the world. For them, literally, it would be if everything was just done with. Now, the phrase means the consummation or the completion. When it talks about the end of the world in verse 3, it talks about everything coming together to complete something. And that's important for us to think about. Well, Jesus makes a reply to them in verses 4 through 51, but we're going to concentrate for just a few moments on what he says the signs will not be. Remember, they asked him, what will the sign of your coming be? Well, he begins by telling them what signs before he turns to the when. He goes on to tell them what these signs will not be. In verse 4, Jesus says, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not frightened, for these things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation, and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away, and will betray one another, and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise, and mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." So Jesus says it's coming, but not yet. And there are going to be things that you think are going to be signs, but it's not the end yet, Jesus says. He says some of the signs that will not be the end are false Christs. He talks about them in verses 4 and 5, and then later on in this chapter, in verses 23 through 26. Now, there are some that are mentioned for us, some of these false messiahs in the New Testament, such as Theudas in Acts chapter 5 and in verse 35, Judas, Acts 5 and verse 37. Another one, some think that Simon, mentioned in Acts chapter 8 verses 9 and 10, set him up later on to be some kind of a Messiah. Many more are mentioned, up to 60 in early writings who claimed to be Messiah, but their claims were found to be false. Jesus says don't listen to them. They're misleaders. Don't go with them. Jesus also mentioned wars, earthquakes, famines in verses 6 through 7, also in Luke chapter 21 verse 11. Now, wars and natural disasters have frequently been viewed as harbingers of the end of the world. And there were many such occurrences in the first century. Political and social unrest were a commonly occurring thing during the turbulence of rapidly changing Caesars of the Roman kingdom. In fact, during one brief period, during AD 68, from June 68 to December of AD 69, there were 5 Roman emperors that changed governments. After Nero committed suicide, there was a brief civil war during which Galba was named emperor, and he was assassinated by Otho, who committed suicide when he was opposed by a fellow named Vitellius. Vitellius was killed by supporters of Vespasian, who declared himself emperor in 69 AD. Jesus talked about famines and earthquakes, which further unsettled people of the time. Between 46 and 63 AD, there were no less than 5 earthquakes that were reported in different areas of the region, in Crete, in Rome, in Apamea, and Laodicea, and Campania, and 2 more are recorded for us in the New Testament, in Matthew 27, during Jesus' crucifixion, and in Acts chapter 16. A famine is predicted in Acts chapter 11, and it took place during the reign of Claudius. And as terrible as all these things might be, Jesus says it's not the end yet. They're just as he tells us, they're just the beginning of birth pangs. He goes on to describe persecutions and difficulties in verses 9 and 10. And of course, this is not the first time or the last time that Jesus would warn about persecution to his disciples. His disciples would endure vast persecution during their time. In fact, it seems to come to them almost immediately after Jesus was resurrected. Remember, Jesus said, if they persecuted me, they'll persecute you. Well, that's exactly what happened. And Jesus said it would be an opportunity for them to present the gospel to their persecutors. And that's exactly what they did. But still, they continued to be harassed by the secular and by the ecclesiastical authorities for what they were, not so much what they did. They were followers of Jesus, and that just did not sit well with those who were opposed to Jesus. And so certainly persecution followed them. And though there would be great difficulty for Christians, Jesus says in verse 14 that the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world. And in Colossians 1 and in verse 23, Paul says that's exactly what happened. The gospel had been preached to the whole world. It had been taken to every known inhabited place of then what was called the world, Rome's vicinity, and certainly far, far beyond. Jesus then turns to what the signs will be in verses 15 through 28. Let's read that together. In verse 15, Jesus said, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, and then Matthew adds a parenthetical statement, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulations, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life could have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner rooms. Do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Now, at the very beginning of this section that we read, Jesus speaks of the abomination of desolation. And Matthew tells us, understand what this means. If you're reading this, let the reader understand. Well, what is this abomination of desolation that was spoken of through Daniel? Daniel spoke of this abomination of desolation twice in his book. In Daniel 9, verse 27, in that famous 70-week prediction that is in the book of Daniel, says, on the week of abominations will come one who makes desolate, until even a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. In chapter 11 of Daniel, in verse 31, goes on to speak and says, forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. Now, it's important for us to see that Jesus further explained what this is in Luke chapter 21 and in verses 20 through 22. Jesus said there, speaking in the same context of this destruction of Jerusalem, he said, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city, because these are the days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. And certainly those things were fulfilled. Jerusalem was surrounded by armies, specifically the Roman armies. J.W. McGarvey, in his Fourfold Gospel, tells us that the Roman armies were fittingly called the abomination of desolation, because being heathen armies, they were an abomination to the Jews, and because they brought desolation upon the country. The sight of them, therefore, became the appointed sign for Christians to quit the city. You remember what Jesus said here in Matthew chapter 24 and in verse 22. He says, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Early writers report that Christians who understood this, who heeded the advice and the advanced warnings of Jesus, fled for their lives, and for that reason were able to preserve their lives. And that's what McGarvey is talking about here. Josephus, in his treatise titled Wars of the Jews, in section 6, in book 6, says, and now the Romans, upon the flight of the seditious into the city, and upon the burning of the holy house itself, and all of the buildings around about it, brought their ensigns to the temple, and set them over against its eastern gate, and there did they offer sacrifices to them, and there did they make Titus imperator with the greatest acclamations of joy. Remember how this abomination of desolation in Daniel chapter 11 was going to come with the end of sacrifices, and then there would come other sacrifices that would be abominations. Well, that's exactly what the Romans did. They set up their holy, or at least their images of Caesar inside the temple itself, which was the height of blasphemy to the Jews. And Jesus tells Christians at least what their reaction should be. In verse 16, those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are out in his house, or get the things out that are in his house. There wouldn't even be time to gather necessities. The time for fleeing would come. And there would be great tribulation that would come. In fact, the tribulation would be so great that fleeing during winter would be just emphatically difficult, since the rainy season and those formerly dry wadis that were all over the place would be torrential. There would be flash flooding. Flight on the Sabbath would also have been difficult, since most walled cities would shut and lock the gates, Jesus foretells a time of horrendous difficulty. Since the final siege of the fall of Jerusalem occurred during the Passover, the city was filled with people. Estimates range anywhere from 1 to 3 million people in a town that generally held far fewer than that. Food, of course, would quickly run out because they couldn't go outside the city to get any more. Josephus told of one woman of what he calls distinguished background who reportedly killed and ate her own son. Tempers quickly flared and people started killing one another inside the barricaded city, in effect doing the Romans' work for them. Starving citizens tortured one another. If there were reports that somebody was hiding food, old people were murdered. People ate leather and even the straw from their own bedding, so desperate were they for food. The atrocities mounted and mounted all the way until the end of the siege. And when it was over, Josephus reports that 1.1 million Jews were killed in Jerusalem, 250,000 more were killed in the surrounding environs, and 97,000 were taken captive. And of those taken captive, some of them made their way to Rome, where they were killed by beasts in the Roman theaters. Others were sent to work in Egypt, and still others were sold as slaves. Great tribulation indeed. And this is what Jesus tried to warn people about so that they could flee from that and hopefully save their own lives. And then Jesus goes on to speak of signs in the heavens that will precede this destruction of Jerusalem. In Matthew chapter 24, beginning in verses 29 through 31, Jesus said, "But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other." Now, remember we were talking about the two views before. Some see that the transition is made here in verse 29 from Jesus talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, switching over to talking about his second coming. And the reason for this confusion is because of Jesus' use of highly figurative language, what we've referred to before as apocalyptic language, especially with reference in verse 30 to the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky. And we'll talk a little bit more about these in just a moment. But we should notice that the time element is closely connected with Jerusalem's fall. I said before that these would be signs that would precede. Actually, they were signs that occurred during, and verse 29 says immediately after the tribulation, those difficulties that we spoke about during the siege and the fall and then the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and its temple. These signs are immediately after the tribulation. In fact, in Mark 13 verse 24, it says that the time element is in those days, referring to, again, the destruction of Jerusalem. We shouldn't fail to recognize that this is judgment language. The language in these verses is highly symbolic, and it's reminiscent of that language that's used by the prophets to signify the judgment of God on various nations. Babylon in Isaiah 13 and verses 1 and following, and Egypt in Isaiah 19. Judgment on Tyre, on Edom, on Nineveh, even on the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And further, this coming on the clouds in verse 30 is highly reminiscent of Daniel chapter 7 and verse 13, where it speaks of a son of man, one like the Son of Man, who was coming and receiving dominion. Well, remember what we said before about how the Jews had absolutely refused to accept Jesus' authority. And because of that, Jesus said that someday they would recognize it. Well, for just a moment, go with me to Luke chapter 19. Luke 19. What we're about to read takes place on the previous Sunday of this Olivet Discourse. We said that it probably takes place, this discourse does, on Tuesday evening of Jesus' final week. When Jesus entered into Jerusalem the previous Sunday, he looked over the city and he cried over it. In verse 41 it says, when he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it. We're in Luke 19 and verse 41. And verse 42 says that Jesus said, if you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you and surround you and hem you in on every side, and they will level you to the ground and your children within you, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. Jesus is talking about the fact that they refused, they rejected him. That was the time of their visitation. The time that Jesus came to present himself as Israel's rightful Messiah, as King of all the earth. And they rejected him. And Jesus said, because of that, if only you knew the price that you will pay for rejecting me. Well, that's exactly what's going on back in Matthew chapter 24, verses 29 through 31. All this apocalyptic language, this figurative language, is judgment language. This coming on the clouds is another description of God's presence. In Isaiah 19 and in verse 1, the prophet says, behold, Yahweh is riding on a swift cloud and is about to come to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. Now, it's not that God was physically present there and had come riding on a cloud as though it were some great misty chariot. The idea is that God was visiting them with judgment. His authority had come upon them. We see the same kind of thing going on in Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 13, where Jeremiah says, behold, he goes up like clouds, and his chariots like the whirlwind. His horses are swifter than eagles. Woe to us, for we are ruined. Now, we look at this metaphoric language, this highly figurative language, and it sounds strange to us, to our Western ears, but it was much plainer to the Jews, since the prophets that they were steeped in spoke in this kind of manner. And so Jesus goes on to give them a parable by which they could know that things were near. In verse 32 of Matthew 24 and in verse 32, Jesus said, now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So in language that people then could understand, they knew that a fig tree and leaf was an indication that summer was coming. They knew that something was coming, right? And that would be the season of summer. These things that Jesus just spoke of, and he uses that phrase, these things, he's been talking about before. The perilous times, the figurative coming of the Son of Man and judgment in the destruction of Jerusalem. All these things, he says, you'll know are coming. Learn the parable from the fig tree simply means that understand the message that I'm trying to teach you concerning what's coming as far as the judgment and the destruction of Jerusalem, as well as the deliverance for Christians that would take place. Those who would be Jesus' disciples would hearken to what he said, would know that what Jesus said was true. Now, the Jews who rejected him simply considered Jesus' teachings as the ravings of a blasphemous lunatic. But to those who believed in him, they knew it was the truth, and they would take those things to heart. And as we mentioned before, reports of early Christians, early Christian writings indicate that they did take what Jesus said as the truth, as truthful warnings, heeded those warnings, and saved their lives. But I don't want us to miss the time that Jesus is saying these things will take place. He says in verse 34, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." Now, a generation was generally thought to be about 40 years. And from the time that Jesus said this was barely 40 years later that the siege on Jerusalem would take place, culminating in its stunning downfall, what truly would have been the seeming like the end of the world for the Jews, which in fact was God's judgment on them for rejecting his son. Well, we've covered part 1 of our great chapters of the Bible study and most of Matthew chapter 24. Our next lesson will take us through the rest of Matthew chapter 24 and on into chapter 25. And we'll talk more about when this change of language from the destruction of Jerusalem to Jesus' second coming may take place. I appreciate you being with us, and I hope that you'll be with us again for part 2 of our study of great chapters of the Bible, Matthew chapters 24 and 25. Thanks for being with us. I appreciate it. God bless you.